Hello everybody, and this is Karama's Girl 018. I am recording the first installment of reading The Stolen Throne. This is going to be over chapter 1, I think, and I'm just going to read each chapter as a separate part, unless they're being really short, just depending on how fast I can read. I will try and give them voices, but some of them I might not be able to do them justice, so I will just read them in my normal voice. So enjoy! Here's chapter 1 of The Stolen Throne. Run, Merrick! And run he did. His mother's dying words whipped him into action, the image of a grisly murder still burning in his mind. Merrick reeled and plunged into the trees at the edge of the clearing. Ignoring the clawing branches that scraped at his face and clung to his cloak, he blindly forced his way into the foliage. Strong hands grabbed him from behind. One of his mother's men, or one of the traitors who had just orchestrated her death? He assumed the latter. Grunting with effort, Merrick shoved back, struggling to dislodge the hold on him. He succeeded only in getting a few more branches striking him in the face, the leaves blinding him further. The hands attempted to haul him back into the clearing, and he dug his boots into the ground, gaining a bit of purchase on gnarled tree roots. Merrick violently shoved back again, his elbow connecting with something hard, something that gave way with a wet crunching sound and a startled grunt of pain. The hands loosened, and Merrick leaped forward into the trees. His cloak resisted, jerking him back. Something had caught on his long leather coat. He twisted and fought frantically like a wild beast caught in a trap, until he somehow wriggled himself out, leaving the cloak torn on a branch. Merrick gasped, launching himself into the darkness beyond the clearing without risking even a glance behind. The forest was old and thick, allowing only the faintest beams of moonlight through the dense canopy. It was not enough to see by, only enough to turn the forest into a maze of frightening shadows and silhouettes. Tall, twisted oaks stood like dark sentinels, surrounded by dense bush and recesses so black they could have held almost anything. He had no idea where he was going. Only his urge to flee guided his feet. He stumbled over roots that jutted out of the uneven ground and bounced off solid tree trunks that kept springing out of nowhere. Wet and slippery mud made his steps treacherous, and his balance so precarious it seemed the ground might give way beneath him at any moment. The woods were completely disorienting. He could have been running in circles for all he knew. Merrick heard men shouting as they entered the woods behind him, giving chase, and he could clearly make out the sounds of fighting as well. Steel blade ringing on steel blade, the cries of men dying. His mother's men, many he had known his entire life. As he frantically ran on, images kept whirling through Merrick's mind. Moments ago, he had been shivering in the cold forest clearing, convinced that his presence at the clandestine meeting was more a formality than anything else. He barely paid attention to the proceedings. His mother had informed him earlier that with the support of these new men, the rebellion would finally become a force. These men were willing to turn on their Orlesian master, she said, and that made an opportunity she wasn't willing to pass up after so many years spent running and hiding, and only picking what battles they could win. Merrick hadn't objected to the meeting, and that idea that it might be risky never even occurred to him. His mother was the infamous rebel queen. It was she who had first inspired the rebellion, and she who led the army. The battle had always been hers and never his. He himself had never even seen his grandfather's throne, never understood the power his family had possessed before the Orlesians invaded. He had spent his entire 18 years in rebel camps and remote castles, endlessly marching and forever being dragged along in his mother's wake. He couldn't even imagine what it might be like to not live that way. It was a completely foreign concept to him. And now his mother was dead. Merrick's balance was ripped from him, and he tumbled in darkness down a short hill covered in wet leaves. He slid awkwardly and slammed his head against a rock, crying out in pain. His vision swam. From far off came a muffled, answering cry of his pursuers. They had heard it. Merrick lay there in the moonlit shadows, cradling his head. It felt like it was on fire, a raging inferno that blotted out reason. He cursed himself for being so stupid. By sheer luck, if nothing else, he had managed to run some distance into the forest, and now he had given away his location. There was a thick wetness on his fingers. Blood was caking in his hair and running down his ears and neck, warm in sharp contrast with the frosty air. For a moment he shook, a single sob escaping his lips. Maybe it was best just to lie here, he thought. Let them come and kill him too. They had already killed his mother and earned whatever lavish reward the usurper had surely promised them. What was he besides an extra body to be slaughtered along with the too few men Mother had brought? And then he froze as a terrible realization seethed at the edge of his unconsciousness. He was the king. It was ridiculous, of course. Him? The one who elicited so many impatient sighs and worried looks? The one for whom Mother always had to make excuses? She had always assured him that once he got older, he would grow into the same easy authority that she evinced. But that had never happened. It was no great offense either, as he had never taken seriously the idea that his mother might actually die. She was invulnerable and larger than life itself. Her death was a hypothetical thing, something that had no actual bearing on reality. And now she was gone, and he was supposed to be king? He was to carry on the rebellion on his own? He could just imagine the usurper upon his throne in the capital, laughing uproariously when he received the news of Merrick's succession. Better to die here, he thought. Better that they put a sword through his gut just as they had done to his mother, than to become the laughingstock of Ferelden. Maybe they would find some distant relative to take up the banner of rebellion. And if not, then it was best to let the bloodline of King Calenhad the Great die here. Let it end with the rebel queen just falling short of her goal, rather than pettering out under the leadership of her inept son. There was a certain amount of peace in that thought. Merrick lay there on his back, the damp coldness of the leaves and mud almost comforting against his skin. The irregular shouts of the men drew nearer, but it was almost possible for Merrick to blot them out. He tried to focus solely on the rustling of the leaves in the wind overhead. The tall trees stood all around him like giant shadows peering down at the tiny figure who had tumbled at their feet. He could smell the pine, the tartness of nearby tree sap. These forest sentinels would be the only witness to his death. And as he lay there, the pain in his head dulling to an intense throb, the thought rankled. The men who had lured his mother here with promises of aid were nobles of Ferelden, the sort who had bent knee to the Orlesians so they could keep their lands. Rather than finally live up to their ancestral oaths, they had betrayed their rightful queen. If no one escaped to inform those who had remained with the rebel army about what had actually happened, they might never know the truth. They would guess, but what would they do with that proof? The traitors might never pay for their crime. Merrick sat up, his throbbing head protesting fiercely. Aching and shivering, he was wet and chilled right to the bone. Getting his bearings was difficult, but he guessed he was not far from the edge of the forest. He had stumbled only a short ways in, and the men chasing him were not far away, searching and calling out to each other. Their voices were getting fainter, however. Maybe he should just remain still. He was in some kind of depression, and if he stayed there long enough, those men would pass him by, giving him enough time to catch his breath. Perhaps he could find his way back to the clearing and see if any of his mother's men had survived. A sudden crunch of twigs nearby made him stop again. Merrick listened carefully in the darkness for an agonizing moment, but heard nothing. The noise had been a footstep, he was sure of it. He waited longer, not daring to move a muscle, and heard it again. Quieter this time. Someone was definitely trying to sneak up on him. Maybe they could see him even if he couldn't see them. Merrick cast about desperately. The far side of the hollow he was in opened up into a downward slope. It was difficult to tell the general terrain with so little moonlight creeping through the canopy. There were also trees in that direction, roots and thick bushes that could prevent him from crawling out of sight. He had to either stay where he was or climb out. A squelch of wet leaves nearly forced Merrick as low to the ground as he could go. Listening closely was difficult given the muted shoutings in the distance and the sound of the wind blowing high in the trees, but he could ever so faintly detect the soft steps of someone passing nearby. He suspected they couldn't see him at all. In fact, it was dark enough that his pursuer would likely end up doing exactly what Merrick had done and fall right into the hollow. Merrick didn't exactly relish the idea of his enemy falling on top of him, and he cautiously tried to get onto his feet. Sharp pain lanced through his knees and arms. There were cuts on his face and hands from the branches, and he was sure there was a gash on his head. But it all felt distant, as if someone else were experiencing the pain. He tried to control his movements, making them slow and quiet, smooth, and if he continued to listen for more footsteps, anxiously biting his lower lip. It was difficult to hear anything over the distant, desperate thumping of his heart. Surely it was obvious to whoever was out there. Perhaps they were closing in for the kill even now, laughing at his terror. Breathing deliberately, sweating despite the chill, Merrick slowly pulled himself upright to get at both his feet underneath him. His right knee spasmed, shooting lightning-sharp agony on his leg, or up his leg. The injury he felt very clearly, unlike the others. In shock, he hissed through gritted teeth, nearly gasping out loud. Immediately he clamped his mouth shut and closed his eyes in silent reprimand at his idiocy. Crouching there in the darkness, he listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped. Someone else, farther out among the trees, shouted in Merrick's direction. He couldn't quite hear what the man had said, but there was definitely a question to it, calling out, asking if they had found anything. But there was no response. The sound of the footsteps nearby had probably heard Merrick and was not willing to give up his own position away by answering. With the utmost care, Merrick crawled up the side of the depression. He squinted into the shadows, trying to pick out anything that might resemble a human form. He imagined his pursuer doing the same thing, playing a cat-and-mouse game in the dark. The first one of them to spot the other would win the prize. Belatedly, Merrick realized that even if he did see this man, there might not be much he could do about it. He wasn't armed. An empty sheath dangled at his waist. His belt knife lent to Hiram not 2 hours earlier to cut some rope. Hiram, one of his mother's most trusted generals and a fine man he had known since childhood, most likely dying at his queen's side, their blood cooling in the midnight air. Merrick cursed himself for a fool and tried to put the image out of his mind. Just then Merrick noticed a glint in the shadows. Narrowing his eyes helped him just barely discern a sword, its polished blade reflecting the faint moonlight. In the mass of dark shadows and bushes, he still couldn't see the form of the man holding the weapon, but it calmed him to finally know where his opponent was. Gaze locked in that direction, Merrick raised his hands to grasp the edge of the depression and quietly heave himself out. The pain that shot through his arms was considerable, but he ignored it and never for 1 second took his eyes off that sword. As he got over the edge, the sword moved. A dark shape began lumbering towards him, raising the sword up high and growling with menace. Without thinking, Merrick launched himself forward and charged. The sword slashed down by his ear, narrowly missing his arm. He rammed headfirst into the man's midsection, knocking the wind out of him. Unfortunately, the pursuer was wearing heavy chain hauberk, and Merrick's head exploded with pain. He may as well have butted a tree. The world spun around him wildly. He would have careened out of control had his momentum not carried the two of them backwards, knocking the man off his feet. They fell on hard, uneven ground, with the swordsman taking the brunt of the impact. His weapon arms swung out to one side, causing the sword to fly out into the shadows. Almost delirious and barely able to see, Merrick pulled himself back up and grabbed the man's head in both hands. He felt a strong whiskered jaw and the man flailing wildly with his free hand, trying to push Merrick off. He tried to shout, possibly calling on his fellows for help, but all that came out was a muted bellow. Merrick used the benefit of the leverage to pull up the man's head and slam it down hard. The man grunted when his head hit an exposed root. "You bastard!" Merrick snarled. The man's desperation intensified, the hand reaching for Merrick's face, slapping and clawing. Finding purchase, it pushed hard against Merrick's nose, one finger digging into his eye. Merrick pulled his face away as he shoved down hard on the man's head, grinding it back onto a root. The man grunted and tried to buck Merrick off, but the heavy hauberk worked against him. He writhed and pushed with that one hand against Merrick's face, but none of his efforts were enough to get him free. Merrick's throbbing head was torture, and his neck was stretched to its limit, trying to pull away. When Merrick let go of the man's head to battle the pushing hand, the bearded man made an attempt to kick Merrick off. Merrick lost his balance for a moment, and the enemy's hand turned into a fist, thumping him solidly across the face. Lightheadedness came over Merrick, and he saw stars. He fought against spooning, reached down, and grabbed as much of the man's long hair as he could, pulling him upright. This time the man bellowed loudly, his hand yanked up at an awkwardly and painful angle. Letting out his own cry of effort, Merrick crashed the man's head down on the tree root a third time, even harder. "You killed her!" Merrick shouted. He picked up the man's head by the hair yet again to slam it down. "You bastard! You killed her!" He smashed the head down again, and again. Tears welled up in his eyes and he choked on his words. "She was your queen and you killed her!" He slammed the head down still harder. This time the man stopped fighting back. A cloying, meaty smell assailed to Merrick's nostrils. His hands were covered with thick, fresh blood that wasn't his own. Almost involuntarily, he fell off the body and scrambled back, his bloody hands slipping on the cold leaves and pain shooting anew through his legs. He half expected the man to rise up and charge at him again, but he didn't. The body lay there in the shadows, a vague shape resting awkward and still upon a clump of tree roots. Merrick could barely make out the great oak behind him, thrusting up into the overhead canopy like a gravestone. He felt physically ill, his stomach twisting in knots and his body shaking. Almost involuntarily, he brought a hand up to his mouth to keep his bile down, smearing fresh blood onto his face. There was gore on his hands, clumps of skin and hair. He convulsed, vomiting on the muddy ground what little lunch he had gotten earlier in the day. Despair threatened to overwhelm him. "You're the king," he reminded himself. Merrick's mother, Queen Mora, was a tower of strength who could lead armies of battle-hardened men to victory. She was every inch her grandfather's daughter. That's what everyone said. She had inspired some of the most powerful noblemen in Ferelden to rise up in her name and fight to put her on the throne, simply because they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that she belonged there. "And now she's gone, and you're the king," he repeated to himself. It felt no more real than it had before. In the distance, the sound of the pursuit was getting louder again. The traders must have heard Merrick struggle with the bearded man. He needed to leave. He needed to run, to keep going. Yet he could not will his legs to move. He sat in the dark forest, his bloody hands held out in front of him as if he had no idea where else to put them. All Merrick could think of was his mother's voice, the last time she had returned from battle. She was in full armor, covered in blood, sweat, and grinning madly. Merrick had been dragged in front of her by his trainer for brawling with a commoner boy. Even worse, Arl Rendorn had been with his mother, and he asked if Merrick had at least won the fight. Burning with shame, Merrick admitted to being soundly beaten, causing the Arl to snort and ask what sort of king Merrick could possibly make. And then his mother had laughed merrily, a laugh that could dispel anything serious. She had taken Merrick's chin in her hand and looked into his eyes, and with a gentle smile told him not to listen to the Jarl. "You are the light of my life, and I believe in you." Man, my voice is starting to hurt. Grief brought Merrick close to laughing and crying at the same time. His mother had believed in him, and yet he had gotten lost in the woods in less than half an hour. Should he somehow elude his pursuers, make it out of the forest, and obtain another horse, he still needed to find a way to locate the army. He was so used to being led around, being told where to go and where to ride, that he hadn't paid attention to any route they'd taken. He had followed as he was bidden. Now he couldn't even guess his location. And thus passes the last true king of Ferelden, he thought with bizarre amusement. He wanted to be a good king, but he didn't know his arse from a hole in the ground. Mad giggling threatened to overtake his tears, but Merrick shut down both reactions. Now wasn't the time to be thinking of the past or grieving. He had just killed a man with his bare hands, and there were other enemies nearby. He needed to run. He took a deep, ragged breath and closed his eyes. Deep down inside of him there was steel. He embraced it, tasted its bitter edge, and let it shut out the whirlwind inside of him. He needed to be calm, even if only for a moment. When he opened his eyes again, he was ready. Merrick cast about calmly for any side of the sword that had thrown out of the man's hand. Everything around him was somewhat moving very slowly, none of it seeming quite real. There was too many bushes, too many odd dips and clumps of trees where the sword could be hiding. He couldn't find it. Then he heard another man's voice, this one calling out from him from somewhere close. There was no more time. Standing gingerly, Merrick listened for where the voices were coming from. As soon as he ascertained their source, he headed in the opposite direction. It was an awkward hobble at first. His legs were bruised and cramped, and he might have broken some bones, but he ignored the pain. With effort, he grabbed onto low-hanging branches and pulled himself further into the darkness. They would pay for what they had done. If he did only one thing as king, he would make them pay. "Something's happening," Logan muttered, frowning. He stood on the edge of the forest, absently wiping mud off his leathers. The effort was pointless, as his clothing was as worn and as filthy as one might expect from a poacher. The Orlesians, of course, had less kind names for him and others like him. Criminals, thieves, and bandits, too. Though only when desperation forced their hand. Not that Lurgan cared much for what the Orlesians called him, since it was their fault his family had been forced off their farm. The Orlesians didn't believe in anyone owning land but their fancy painted-up nobility, so it came as no surprise that they didn't look favorably on Ferelden freemen. An extra tribute tax was concocted by the Orlesian emperor, and any freemen who couldn't afford it had their lands confiscated. Logan's father had managed to scrape together enough to pay the tax the first year, so naturally it was decided the tax could stand to be even higher. The next year, his father refused to pay, and when the soldiers came, they determined that not only was the farm held forfeit, but his father would also be arrested for tax evasion. Logan's family resisted, so now they lived out in the Ferelden wilds, banding together with other desperate souls to eke out a living however they could. Logan might not have cared what the Orlesians thought of him, but he did much care to avoid being arrested. The local constable over in Lothering was a Ferelden man, and so far he had been tolerant of their band. So long as they didn't prey on travelers and restricted their thefts to the petty sort, the constable made only token efforts to track them down. Logan knew that the man was going to be forced to hunt them in earnest someday, and hopefully he would be decent enough to let them know ahead about it in advance. They would move on as they had already done many times. There were enough forests and hills in Ferelden to hide an entire army after all. Even the rebel queen knew that. But what if the constable didn't warn them? That thought worried Logan now, and it had him staring into the forest. Men didn't always get to do as they prefer. A cold wind blew across the field, making him shiver. It was late, and the moon shone down from a cloudless night sky. He wiped the black curls out of his eyes, resigned to the fact that his hair was no doubt as dirty as his hands, and pulled his hood up. The spring had been more of a lingering winter that had refused to let go. The cold nights he and his band had spent in their makeshift tents had been less than comfortable, to say the least, but the accommodations were preferable to some of the alternatives. Dannon, a big brute of a man with an untrustworthy air, walked up behind him. Locaine suspected that Dannon had once been a thief, a dedicated sort who lived in the cities, picking pockets and robbing travelers. "I can't, Mom. I'm recording a book reading." "I can't. I'm busy at the moment." And that he was here with them now because he wasn't a very good one. Not that Logan was in much of a position to judge him. They did what they could, all of them, and Dannon pulled his weight. That didn't mean Logan had to feel comfortable around the man. "What's that you're saying? You saw something?" Dannon scratched his beak of a nose while he adjusted the carcasses he was carrying. There were 3 rabbits along his shoulder, the prize of the evening's work, poached from the fields of a lord known for his Orlesian sympathies. Hunting in the dark was never easy, especially when one took more care to avoid being spotted than to actually hunt, but they had been fortunate for once. "I said that something's happening," Logan repeated irritably. He turned and glared at Dannon, and the man backed away a step. He had that effect on people. Logan had been told before that his blue eyes lent him an icy, intense air that could put people off, and that was fine by him. Logan was still considered young by most in the camp, Dannon especially, and he preferred that the man didn't get any notions about trying to give him orders. "Are you telling me you haven't noticed?" Dannon shrugged. "There's some tracks, I think. Maybe there's some soldiers about." "And he didn't think that was of any interest?" "Ah," he rolled his eyes. "Carolyn down at the village already told us there'd be soldiers, didn't she? Said she saw a band Serlich marching through the north field with some of his fellows just this morning." Logan frowned at the name. Serlich is a lickspittle, desperate for favor with the Orlesian usurper. Everyone knows that. Yes, well, Carolyn said he was marching well out of sight and didn't even stop at the inn, like he didn't want to be seen. Logan gestured at the rabbits Dannon carried. "Look, whatever he's up to doesn't have anything to do with us. Nobody saw us hunting. We're good. We should go." He smiled, a nervous, friendly smile meant to be reassuring. Dannon was afraid of him, which was as Logan preferred it. He looked back into the forest, his hand grazing the sword belted at his side. doing a book reading. I had people vote on it, and I'm getting to do this series, but I don't know how much more time I've got left. Danon's eyes followed the motion, and he grimaced. Danon was skilled enough with a knife, but hopeless with anything larger. "Oh, come on, don't go making trouble," he groaned. "I'm not interested in making trouble," Logan insisted. "I'm interested in avoiding it." He advanced toward the forest's edge, crossing over a ridge that had him downhill a ways. "Nobody has to have seen us hunting to know that we're here. You know as well as I that we may have overstayed our welcome." "That's not for you to decide," Danon said, but he followed quietly after that. It was Logan's father who would decide after all, and even a man like Danon knew that Logan and his father were seldom of different minds when it came to such matters. As it should be, Logan thought to himself, his father hadn't raised a fool. The pair of them descended into the dark forest, pausing only once to let their eyes adjust to the patches of moonlight that managed to snake through the canopy above. Danon grew increasingly agitated by the treacherous ground, even though he had sense enough to stay quiet. Come on, how much longer is this? Dang! Sorry, I might have to cut this thing short. For his part, Logan was beginning to think Danon might have the right of it. He was just about to turn them both around when Danon stopped short. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Good ears," Logan thought. "Animal?" "No," he shook his head uncertain. "Sounds more like shouting." The two of them stood still, and Logan tried to be patient and listen. The breeze rustled the branches overhead in a significant distraction, but after a moment he heard what Danon was referring to. It was faint, but in the distance he could pick up the sounds of men calling to each other, engaged in some kind of search. "It's a fox hunt." "Huh?" Logan restrained the urge to roll his eyes. "You were right," he said tersely. "They're not here for us." Danon seemed pleased by the news. He shifted the rabbits on his shoulder and turned to go. "So let's not wait around then. It's late." But still, Logan hesitated. "You said Ben Starlick passed through. How many men did he have with him, do you think?" "I don't know. I didn't see them, did I?" "What did your bar wench say exactly?" The big man shrugged, but his back stiffened in quiet rage. Logan noticed with a vague interest that he had hit a sore spot. A dalliance, then? Not that Logan truly cared, but it was better to avoid provoking the big man needlessly. "I don't know," Danon gritted out. She didn't say. It didn't sound like a lot. Sorry, guys, but I'm going to have to cut this off now because I don't know how much more I can record on this. Sorry, guys. I was actually able to save it, so I'm just going to continue with the chapter. Only got like a few pages left, so I should be good for then. Logan figured there must easily be 20 men out there. Surely if Van Serlich had brought that many men near Lothering, it would have caused more comment. So what was going on exactly? The fact that it involved one of the Ferelden noblemen most notorious for his open allegiance to the Orlesian tyrant did not sit well with him. Whatever Sherlock and his men might be up to, it was undoubtedly not good for the band, even if it didn't involve them directly. As Logan stood there trying to ignore Danon's impatience, he conceded to himself that there might be nothing he could do either way. The political goings-on of Ferelden were none of his concern. Survival was his concern, and anything political was important only when it affected that survival directly. He sighed irritably, staring off into the shadows as if they would provide the answer to his mystery. Danon harumphed. "You sound like your father when you do that." "That may be the first compliment I've heard from you." He snorted derisively, glaring at Logan. "It wasn't intended." He spat down between them. "Look, that doesn't involve us, like you said. Let's go." Logan didn't like being challenged. He met Danon's glare with his own, and for a long moment he said nothing. "If you want to go," he stated quietly, "then go." Danon stood his ground, though Logan saw the man shift nervously. Danon didn't want to be in this position. Logan could almost sense him thinking about his knife there in the dark, wondering if he would need to use it, wondering how he would get back to camp if he did so. Logan was tempted to push it further. He wanted to step right up in front of Danon's face and take his measure. Maybe Danon had the guts to knife him and be done with it. For all Logan knew, he was a murderer, the sort who liked to cut people just to hear them scream, and that was the past he had fled. Maybe Logan was being foolish by not going along with his suggestion, but he doubted that. The silence between them was long and tense, intended not only by the sound of the wind in the trees and the far-off shouts of the hunters. Logan narrowed his eyes, not even touching his sword hilt, and was inwardly pleased as Danon was the first to look away. The moment was broken by the sound of someone approaching. Dannon leaped at the interruption, letting the urgency of the new threat cover up the fact that he had yet just backed down. As though their standoff had never happened, but Logain knew. Something was coming towards them, fast and clumsy. Whatever it was, it scrambled madly through the bushes, heedlessly pushing branches away in its panic. The fox, Logain surmised. Of course, it would end up right in their lap, wouldn't it? If there was truly a maker up in the heavens, as the priest said, he had a troublesome sense of humor indeed. Dannon retreated a few feet, nervous and agitated, while Logain drew his sword, waiting. Their guests were suddenly fell into view, deposited out of the shadows like an unwanted gift, and then stopped short, staring at the two of them with wide, fearful eyes. It was a young man Logain's age, or perhaps younger. His fair hair and fairer skin were obscured under scratches, leaves, dirt, and a healthy dose of blood. He certainly wasn't dressed for a run in the woods, wearing only a tattered shirt and enough mud to make one think he had escaped whoever he was running from by crawling around on his belly. The blood covered his face as well as his hands. Probably not all his. Whoever this man was, he had likely killed to get away, which told Logain just how desperate the intruder might be. The new arrival crouched behind them in the shadows like a caught animal, frozen between fight and flight. Behind him, the shouting drew near. Logain slowly raised a hand, carefully showing his palm to the fugitive to demonstrate that he meant no harm, and then he put his sword back in its scabbard. The blind man didn't move, only narrowed his eyes suspiciously. His attention darted nervously behind him as more muffled shouts came through the trees. "Let's get out of here!" Dannon hissed behind him. "He's going to lead them right to us." "Wait," Logain whispered, not taking his eyes off the fugitive. Dannon bristled yet, and Logain caught a glimpse of the knife now in his hand. Holding out his hands to calm both of them down, Logain turned back to look at the blood-covered man in the shadows. "Who's chasing you?" he asked slowly. The blond man licked his lips, and Logain saw calculation in his eyes. "Or Legion dogs," he said evenly. Still he didn't move. Logain glanced at Dannon. The big man was grimacing, but Logain could tell he wasn't without sympathy for the fellow's situation. No doubt he was interested only in his own hide, but finally he relented with a grunt. "Good answer." Logain took a step back and half-turned as if to leave. "Come with us." Dannon swore unhappily, refusing to look at anything but the ground as he sheathed his knife and stalked off. Logain made as if to follow him, but waited to see if the fugitive would fall in too. For a long moment the blond man was visibly torn. Then without further hesitation he sprang up from his crouch and ran after them. The three proceeded quietly back the way Logain and Dannon had come, the blond man trailing and Dannon staying ahead as if he were close to leaving them behind. The state of the big man's shoulders said he was angry and resentful. Logain didn't care. They kept up a brisk pace, and after a short time the shouts of the blind man's pursuers were left behind. The stranger seemed relieved, and appeared even more at ease as they approached the edge of the forest, and moonlight could be seen more clearly overhead. Getting a better look at him, Logain couldn't help but be a bit mystified. The man's clothes, while torn and dirtied, were plainly of quality, if not fancy. The boots, in particular, seemed solid, made of fine leathers, the sort that Logain saw Templars wear on occasion. So no pauper, certainly. He was also shivering and jumped at every strange forest sound, so this hike was no normal event for him, not by a long shot. "Dannon, wait!" Logain called out as they came to a halt. Dannon stopped only reluctantly. Logain turned to the blind man, who now edged back with renewed suspicion, his eyes darting between them, as if wondering who was going to come after him first. "This may be as far as we can go," Logain reluctantly acknowledged. "Thank the Maker," Dannon muttered under his breath. The man considered for a moment, looking around as if to judge his location. The field outside the forest could be seen from where they were. "I can find my own way from here." Logain couldn't place the young man's accent, but from the way he spoke he was clear he was educated. A merchant's son, perhaps? "Is that so?" He gestured at the blind man's tattered clothing, noticing he didn't even have a cloak. "You look more likely to freeze before you even reach town." He raised an eyebrow. "If that's where you intend to head, with those men after you?" "Why were they after you?" Dannon demanded, shoving his way up beside Logain. The blond man paused, glancing between Logain and Dannon, as if uncertain to whom he should be responding first. Then he looked down at his hands and started the dark stains of blood in the moonlight, as if for the first time. He was clearly repelled, despite his efforts to fight down his reaction. "I think I killed one of them," he breathed. Dannon whistled appreciatively. "They won't give up easily, then." Logain's brow furrowed. "Those were Ban Serlich's men, I take it." Some of them, the blind man agreed reluctantly. They killed a friend of mine. The pain that crossed his face told Logan that the last statement was true enough, at least. The blond man closed his eyes, shivering again, and tried vainly to wipe some of the blood from his cheek. Logan glanced at Dan, and the big man shrugged in response. Whatever the full story was, Logan doubted they were going to get it. And perhaps it wasn't necessary to do so. This stranger wasn't the first person they had encountered who had crossed the Orlesians. And if Logan was in this man's shoes, he wouldn't trust them either. There was definitely more here than met the eye, but Logan's gut told him that whatever this was, it wasn't a trick, and his gut was seldom wrong. Look, Logan sighed heavily. We don't know for sure who's hunting you back there. You say they're working with the Orlesians. I'm willing to take your word for it. The blind man looked about to object, but Logan held up a hand. Whoever they are, it sounded like there were quite a few of them. They're going to figure out soon enough that you got out of the forest. First place they're going to look for you is in Lothering. Do you have somewhere else to go? The blond man hung his head, looking grim. No, I suppose not. Nowhere I can get to easily. Then he set his jaw and looked up at Logan. But I'll make do. For a moment, Logan actually believed he might try. No doubt he would fail, but he would try. Whether this was a sign of stubbornness or foolishness or even something else, he couldn't tell. We have a camp, Logan offered. It's hidden. You don't have to help me. I know that. I'm grateful. His look was reluctant. It's not necessary. If nothing else, I'm sure we can find an old cloak for you. Get you cleaned up and less conspicuous, he shrugged. Or you can go in your own way. Up to you. Sorry, my throat's starting to hurt. The fellow squirmed, shivering again in the cold as a breeze blew in from the field. For a moment, Logan thought he looked lost, adrift in his own little free-fall from whatever life he had led. Fate could hand you a poor hand when you least expected it. That Logan knew very well. He recognized the signs, even if his sympathy was minimal. This offer was all the blind man was going to get, after all. Dan had snorted. Maker's breath, man. Will you look at yourself? What else are you going to do? Logan eyed the big man dubiously. You changed your tone rather quickly. Bah! You're the one who dragged him along. Now that he's here, he might as well just come on. He turned on his heel and stomped off. If it'll get me back to a fire any faster, I'm all for it. The young man stared at the ground uncomfortably and shamefaced. I don't have anything valuable. And then he added, to repay you, I mean. To steal was what he really meant. But it was hard to be offended when he and Dannon were indeed thieves, after all. It certainly doesn't look that way, does it? There wasn't much else the blind man could say. He nodded lamely. Logan motioned his head toward Dannon, who was already long gone. We'd better catch up to him then before he manages to fall in a hole somewhere. He stepped forward and extended a hand. You can call me Logan. The blond man hesitated a fraction before taking Logan's hand and shaking it. Hiram. It was a lie, of course. Logan wondered for a moment if he would regret doing this. His gut had never been wrong before, but there was always a first time. Still, the die had been cast. Nodding